Conviction is brought to you by Three Rings Circus Productions. For links to our valued sponsors and all the show notes from this podcast, please visit our website, threeringscircus.com.au. In this episode of Conviction, the team discover more details about the Kalache operation. Craig is saved by a kangaroo, and back at the hospital with Jessica, he tries to lighten the mood.
So knowing that these guys are waiting for a cook, it was quite an important day for us. So we set a couple of guys out to make sure we were sitting off Kalaches for that whole day. We had no idea who was coming or when they were coming. And again, we could actually see visually through our office with a camera that was in the foyer, but we actually wanted to see someone pull up so we had an idea of a follow later on. Because if this guy was coming to collect the bucket and talk about a cook, it was always good to find out whether there's one or two or what sort of car he was going to have. And sure enough, a car pulled up. We didn't know who it was. It was a new car. It was a white ute. And a scruffy little guy, weedy guy, gets out and walks into the front foyer. And again, there was people in and out of the unit all the time, but was this our man? And all of a sudden, because we only see him from the foyer, a couple of probably 10 or 15 seconds later, we hear there it is, the knock on the door. Enter Lyndall Maskell was his name. Kalache greets him, open arms, and this big voice that, bellows through the place. The other two guys didn't know him, so Kalache had met him somewhere. There wasn't a lot of talk about previous history and things like that. It was just the normal crap that they speak to start with. Parker had the same sort of big voice, and Bonnie was Mr. Mumbles in the corner. And, to cut the story short, they had the Sudafed there that had all been broken down, and he talked that he'd have no worries, getting the pseudoephedrine out of it. It would just be another process. He was pretty much right to go. We had no idea where they were going to go, where the lab was going to be set up. All we knew now was that this guy was leaving the apartment with a bucket. So we saw him come out of the apartment with the bucket, placed it into the back of his ute. He had a big blue tarp over the back of the ute, which is fantastic for us because it's sort of like a beacon. When you're following a white ute, there's so many tradies in Sydney in white utilities. It's very hard. But when you've got a big blue tarp over the back of it, it makes things very easy. We didn't have to follow him far. He virtually went from Clovelly over towards Bondi Junction, probably 10 minutes. And we saw him go into an underground car park of a unit block and disappear. And we obviously couldn't all jump out and follow him in there. We had to get someone in there. We needed eyes to see what was going on. And one of the boys from memory, I think he even had a skateboard. He jumped on the skateboard and rode it down through the unit block and noticed that Maskell was parked adjacent to a carport or a garage. It was a garage, it wasn't a carport, a lockable garage, and was putting things from the back of the ute into the garage. So he made note of what it was and left the garage because you couldn't hang in there for a long time with Maskell doing that, otherwise it'd become obvious. And we just had to wait then. We saw Maskell come out and he had an empty ute. There was no blue tarp. Ute was empty. He's gone off. We followed him pretty much for the next hour and a half into the afternoon. He went and did shopping. And again, he was pretty similar to the Melbourne identities where he went and bought a lot of canned food, powder food, stuff that we thought, okay, he's doing similar. He's going to go and into a couple of days where he's not going to go too far. He's going to be hopefully doing the cook and staying alone and using all these goods that he was just about to buy. He also went to a hardware, we noticed, and bought some materials there, which we thought, okay, he's probably going to buy things to set up the lab if he hasn't got it already set up, and that's what that would be for. He didn't go back to the garage. He just went back to a unit that we found out later that he rented in Bondi. It was only a small unit. And from memory, he'd spoken to Kalache on the phone. We got a recording from the telephone intercept that he said he was set up and he was going to leave in the morning. So we had two things to do. We had to set up a crew ready to take him in the morning, and we also had to try and get into this garage with another legal covert warrant. So we applied that afternoon for a warrant and set ourselves up again. These are long days. We'd been working during the day, managed to get home, help Lisa feed the kids and do all those things, and then had to leave home at 11 o'clock that night, ready for a midnight search warrant in this place. I didn't go in this particular night. We had a couple go in. I was on external watch to make sure nothing happened, but the boys went in, and again it was full of drugs, drug paraphernalia, everything that was needed for the cook. There was beacons and half a science lab in there. There was already some produced drugs that he'd obviously done from somewhere else. And one other thing that we found, he had firearms in there.
A firearm always escalates the investigation and raises the team's level of alert to the maximum. In Australia, there is no Second Amendment. A citizen's right to bear arms does not exist and is highly unusual and suspicious to find any sort of firearm in a city environment. It's possible to apply for a firearm licence and purchase a weapon, but these are usually only granted to members of sporting shooters associations or farmers in rural settings. Craig suspected our cook wasn't planning on duck hunting anytime soon.
Yeah, the firearm had a bit of a meaning actually in the later stages. We later find out that the gun was used in an armed robbery where it shot someone after we seized it later on after arrest, but we did ballistic checks on it and that was a story with a gun. So this guy wasn't just a cook, he'd been involved in certain other things and was one to watch. We managed to get all the samples taken of the drugs, see what was in there, what he was going to be loading in hopefully the next day. Check on this gun and other things, and obviously collate more evidence. And then it was a matter of getting home by about 2 a.m. and then getting back there by about 7. We had to set up early. Some of the other ones who didn't work the night before set up earlier, so we didn't have to get there, at 5 a.m. But it wasn't long. I think he was probably out of there by about 7:30. And again, we had no idea where we're going, where this cook was going to take place, whether it was an industrial area, whether it was in farmland, whether it was in a rented property, and we didn't know how long the follow was going to be. Anyway, we followed him. He was in his ute. He put the blue tarp back on, and off we went. We went north over the harbour bridge, through North Sydney, and we ended up on the expressway heading up the coast. And here you are. You don't know how far he could have gone to the border as far as we knew, but he ended up going to Barrington Tops. So he drove for about 2 hours, turned left off the main highway out of Sydney, and then headed up to a little place called Stroud, which is a small town in the highlands, pretty well known for its beautiful creeks and rivers and things that flow through Stroud. It's a nice, green, lush area. We ended up following him through to Stroud, and he turned off onto a dirt road. There's a single lane again. This is coming back to similar to the Melbourne job. Very hard to follow. We had to push back on the follow. We had managed to get a tracking device into his car that night, so we used that, and it showed that he'd turned off into a property. So we started slowing down, and we managed to, one of the guys who went past called it, and they'd seen that he'd gone up into a driveway which led up to a farmhouse, probably about 400 metres off the road. It was up at a higher level than the road. So myself and the other guy managed to go past the place, dump our cars past there out of sight. And once they're out of sight, both of us got out onto foot, and we managed to just come over the crest of the hill and watch him. My partner had some binoculars, which was good, so he got those out of the car. And we could see that he met someone at this property. And they were talking there for probably about 10 minutes. And we could see it was just a male. We couldn't tell how old he was or whatever. We could see what he was wearing. That was about it through the binoculars. And next thing, Masked Girl then backs his car up. And there's a caravan there, and he picks up the caravan, puts it on the back of the ute, and he comes back to the road and then up this dirt road just near the entrance of this house and out through a valley. The situation was where we were on where the driveway or the road that he took, on the left-hand side, there was a house which he'd got the caravan from. It was sort of cleared farming land. And he'd taken up through this dirt track in this gully, and there's bushland on the right, and obviously this guy's property on the left. We had no idea where this went, and all of a sudden he just went out of sight. So my partner and I looked at each other, and next thing we know, we're off on foot and running through to where he'd gone, and we've got ourselves into the dense bushland on the right side and followed a creek bed up. We obviously wanted to see roughly where he was going and what he was doing and how he was going to be set up if we could. So we started to walk up this creek bed, very hidden by all the bushland and the boulders and things like that. It was slippery, wet, mossy. We could hear him in the distance, so he wasn't far away, and we could sort of get a slight visual. We didn't want to go too far up there, but we sort of knew that he'd driven up probably about 5 minutes. We'd been walking for a little while, and we stopped there because we didn't want to go too far. We thought that was it. We thought, okay, well, he's going to set up there now and he's going to be camped in there. But lo and behold, all of a sudden we hear his car coming back. And as we're doing this, we also hear, coming from the other direction, it was a dog. I looked at my partner and we're just going, what the hell's going on here? Next thing, this dog is getting louder and louder. And we hear the bloke, well, it was obviously the bloke from the property, he was walking along this track to where Marskell had gone. My partner and I darted down into the deepest part of this creek behind these massive boulders and just hid. We're trying to obviously get down right in the water underneath these boulders. This dog knew we were there. There's no doubt about it. It was getting louder and closer and going off. And the guy's just walking behind yelling at the dog, "Shut up, you stupid mutt. It's only kangaroos." Myself and my partner were just giving each other a stare thinking, I hope that's all it is. This dog doesn't come any closer. What are we going to do? What are we going to say? So yeah, these times are really, really tense. This dog just kept bellowing out these loud barks, and Marskell and him virtually met right near us, probably 50 metres, but up onto the track. And luckily the dog's backed off. The guy's called him in and it's gone back to the owner, and they're talking. We couldn't hear what they were talking about, but they're talking. Anyway, he's jumped into the car with Marskell and they've headed back out the way they came, back out towards the guy's property.
There is the often repeated misconception about kangaroos jumping down the main streets of Australian cities. And while, of course, this isn't the reality, it's not far from the truth. Kangaroos are often spotted roaming around the outskirts of our nation's capital and in the Australian bush and rural areas. They are everywhere. And on this occasion, the false assumption that roos were close by, as they often are, saved Craig's entire covert operation.
The rest of the crew who had come up with a follow had actually gone into town and started looking for accommodation because they thought that's it, Marskell's going to set up. But Marskell had taken off. We didn't even know where he'd taken off to. We had a tracking car up there. They'd obviously heard that he'd gone. And in this part of town, we had no communication. The radios didn't work. We're very remote. So we had no communication. So my partner and I, the only thing we could do was get back out to where we had communication. And we soon got onto the tracking car, and he was heading back to Sydney. The rest of our crew, which was 4 others, they'd gone into town organising food and accommodation to stay for some period of time. And myself and my partner were in the cars ripping back to Sydney, unbeknownst to them. And it wasn't until a later date that they called in and found out that Marskell had actually disappeared from Stroud, and here they were, booked in with their accommodation and food. But they stayed there. Obviously, Marskell was going to come back. We believed that he hadn't been able to transport all the gear up on that one particular day, and he was going back to his garage to get more. We hadn't been able to go in and check a second time whether he had taken everything. And that was it. We went back, myself and my partner, and the tracking car, and took him back, and that's where he went. He went back and got some more gear and took off back up to the property.
The cook was progressing, and it was time to bring in the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. As we discovered in an earlier episode, these backyard operations can claim they're making perfume or any number of legal substances until a certain level of chemical reaction has occurred. It's a very specialised area of policing, monitoring the progression and making the bust at the perfect time.
Luckily, our boss had the foresight to see that this was going to be a cook that was going to involve specialists, so he brought in 2 guys from the DEA. It was actually the same 2 guys that we'd used out of the Melbourne job down at Picton, and they were brought in to look after this actual investigation with Maskell. They said it was very unusual, the setup that he was doing. He was running a generator to the caravan, where the generator was put way out further on lead, so the noise wasn't there. And he had set it up so it was like a bush camp. And he said, the DEA guy said, it was uncommon. Most times it was in industrial areas or rented houses, but to have this sort of bush camp, it was similar to what they do with cocaine and thing overseas or in Mexico, where they have it out in bush labs. I didn't have a day off the next day. The boss actually asked me, because I was probably the only one left in town. The rest were up there running around looking for things, how we could put bush cameras in, etc. My boss said, can you go up and take some photos with a helicopter with the Polair? And I thought, of course I can. Only take a couple of hours to get up and back. And I didn't have to go to hospital at that time. I managed to get the time off, so it was my first time in a helicopter. And I stupidly replied to the pilot that it was my first time. And I'm sure he was trying to show off. These are ex-Vietnam vet guys that were police now and in the police Polair branch for that reason, and they were bloody good pilots. And we headed off straight up the coast, just above the swell line. It was fantastic going up, and I was actually pegging the thing out, knowing that I was going to have to paddle up the coast to Newcastle, because the pilot said, we'll go to Newcastle, refuel, and we'll head out to Stroud, and you'll have to take us into where the property is. And that's what we did. Went in there. It was a fantastic trip. Found the property, which was quite hard. We're up, I think, at 10,000 feet. You get to a point where you can't actually hear the helicopter. So if Maskell did happen to be down on the ground and I was up there at the time, he actually, unless he had really good vision and was looking for us, he wouldn't really know we're there. So my job was I had to go up there, take the photos. You got a special piece of machinery that you clip onto your camera that stops the vibrations from the helicopter, and I got some fantastic stills which we ended up coming back down to Sydney and blowing them up, so we had a good mud map of what was around the area and how we could set things up. And that's what happened. I left the rest of that job to the other members, and I went back to dealing with my days off and Jessica in hospital or at home.
Even at the pointy end of a lengthy covert operation such as this, Craig always had the support of his commander, allowing him to be close to Jessica and the family during crucial times in her cancer treatment. This was one occasion when he stayed back at base while the other team members continued the surveillance of the drug cook at Stroud.
And that was, again, it was really needed sometimes when you're working these long hours and the responsibility is left on Lisa or her family. I needed to then pull back a lot of time to be able to help at home as well, not just with Jessica, but with the other kids. As I said before, we just had to show as much time as we could with Tim and Kylie.
The Kalache job was heating up. Jessica was in the thick of cancer treatment, and Craig's marathon was fast approaching. Each of these areas of his life demanded his full attention. He was beginning to feel stretched for time. Had he taken on too much? That was the big question. However, as usual with the Gouzets, family was the answer.
The training had intensified, the charity intensified. I was out dealing with sponsors. Luckily, I had Lisa's sister. They were living with us at the moment, her and her husband, Rod. Kathy was a really close sister with Lisa, had grown up sharing a bedroom her whole life, and now they were actually living with us at the time. They didn't have a house, and we had quite a big property in Avalon, and I split into two and gave Rod and Kath half the house to live in. And Kath had more or less become the right-hand man for me with my marathon. She was very good with organising and paperwork, and she worked for a marketing company. So she already had a good idea on what we needed sponsorship-wise and products and things like that. Very approachable and a very lovable girl. And also Jessica's godmother, which even meant, more to her as well. So I was, spending a lot of time there with Kath at home, the kids running around doing their normal things and dealing with that. These things, again, don't happen to someone who hasn't done anything before. I found, it was my very first marathon and no one knew who I was or what I did. We were running on a budget of zero, so everything that we got for the marathon had to be either out of our pockets or donated, and that's how we worked it. I was really particular about every cent that we raised actually went purposely into equipment or things I was trying to raise money for. I didn't want to have to raise money and spend it on telephone bills that were, racking up, or on any gear or petrol and things like that. So it was a massive process organising the 16-day event on a budget of zero.
In order to get on top of things, Craig often took his surveillance report paperwork to the hospital. This turned out to be not only an efficient use of time, but occasionally led to some more light-hearted moments in an otherwise dire hospital setting.
I remember I had a lot of backed up information that I had to do paperwork for work, and I thought I may as well do it while I'm in hospital, sitting there doing a lot of the charity stuff. And when I do the follows, I had a small recorder. So if you say, it's 7:30 in the morning, Marskell's taken off down George Street, we're heading towards the Harbour Bridge, and you keep making notes. Okay, we're on Pacific Highway heading north. It's now 8:10. Marskell by himself. So continue. We had to log all this for evidence later on at court if he pleaded not guilty. So it's a massive paperwork thing. And I remember being in the hospital, and Jessica was on chemo, and I'm doing my surveillance report while I'm sitting there, and the machine kept beeping, which is like a mistake. It would cut out. And the nurses have got to come in and they reset the machine. It's a bit of a pain in the bum, and it has this real piercing pitch noise. And I'd been sitting there for a while, and Jessica was there reading or watching a movie. And I said to Jess, just turn that movie off for a second and just pretend to read. She said, what? And I said, next time it beeps, I'm going to do something. So next time this piece of machinery beeped, I actually recorded it on my little handheld recorder. And she said, what are you going to do, Dad? I said, you watch. So next time it beeped, the nurse came in and she, spent 10 seconds, walked out of the room, and as she walked out of the room, I hit my tape recorder, which had the recorded beeping. The actual machine was functioning, but I had the noise coming out of my tape machine. As she came back into the room, I'd just click it off under my lap. And then as she went to touch the machine, it would click off. She goes, oh, stupid machine. I kept doing this probably 3 or 4 times until Jessica broke up. And the nurse looked at me and she knew straight away Alice had become a good friend of the family. She came over and gave me a whack and said, you're a bastard. I had the machine then and kept beeping, and she just walked out with a big smirk on her face. Another one of those moments where you just got to, chill out and make a hard time a fun time.
It was time to turn his attention back to the Kalache job and the drug cook that was in progress near the sleepy New South Wales town of Stroud. Remember those drug enforcement specialists, the DEA? It was time for them to see if the drug manufacturer had progressed enough to rule out the perfume defence.
Up at, I'd kept in touch with the crew that were back up at Stroud, and things seemed to be going well. They managed to get some bush cameras in, and they could actually go and watch what was going on a screen that they had set a couple of kilometres away from the property. And Marskell again was into a position where he hadn't left the property. We actually needed to try and get in there and find out to what stage he was. We had to set up every day as though he was going to leave or what he was going to do, and there was one particular day, again, we were set up to go in with a covert warrant already given to us so we could go and check the property. And Marskell was seen to leave, which was unusual. We didn't know whether he was coming back to Sydney or what he was doing, but he actually turned left out of the property, which was to go back to Stroud. It was probably about a 15-minute drive into Stroud, so it was a perfect opportunity. While one of our crew followed him into Stroud to see what he was up to, the others quickly ripped into the property with, again, a specialist, an independent specialist, to check on the stage of the cook. So as Marskell's coming into town, they've gone into the property, they've found that the cook has got to a stage where it's a drug. It's not a perfume as it could have been, but has got to a good stage. They were predicting that it was going to be another 1 or 2 days until he'd actually dry it out and then probably come back with a couple of kilos of gear. Marskell went into town for a reason, and we soon found that he went straight into town. He got a few more supplies, but he also went to a chemist. We sent one of our females into the chemist to have a look and listen to what he was doing, and we found out that he had actually burnt himself. He didn't obviously tell the chemist that he'd burnt himself cooking drugs, but he'd burnt his arm quite bad and was after some sort of relief of pain and a cream to put on it, and he was advised, he should go to the doctors. He didn't go to the doctors, of course. He's gone straight back out with the products, and he's gone back out to the property. Meanwhile, our guys had got out without being seen, which was great. And we knew that we were already there. It was a manufacture without doubt, and we just had to play it now to what suited us. We didn't want to go in and arrest him because Kalache was, in the midst of producing drugs. We wanted to see where this went and what happened, and luckily we did, because what happened next was quite turning, I suppose, in relation to why we were set up as Operation Gaimea.
In the next episode of Conviction, the corrupt relationship between Kalache and Detective Irwin becomes clearer, and a trap is set.